Today we're at Zane Grey house. This is a historic marker, but is also a viewer submitted video thanks to Colleen. So let's read the sign. Zane Grey, 1872 to 1939. The prolific author of Western novels lived on this property 1905 to 1918. Among his books written here was the famed Riders of the Purple Sage. He had a lifelong love for the area, and his remains now rest within view of the house. I remember vividly that my dad had a whole shelf full of these Zane Grey books, and they just were so neat because the colors, the artistry on the dust jackets was just really awesome. My dad was a huge Western fan, both movies and books, and Zane Grey was I think his favorite author. But yeah, he was a phenomenal writer and very, very good at what he did. He had a hard time though getting into it, and we'll go into it in this video. Zane Grey, he was actually Pearl Zane Grey, January 31st, 1872 to October 23rd, 1939. He was an American author and a dentist. It's an odd combination. He is known for his popular adventure novels and stories associated with the Western genre in literature and the arts. And he idealized the American frontier. Riders of the Purple Sage, 1912, was his best-selling book. That was one that my dad owned, I remember that. In addition to his success with his printed books, they also had second lives and a continuing influence when they were adapted for films and television. His novels and short stories were adapted into 112 films, 2 television episodes, and a television series called Dick Powell's Zane Grey Theater. Zane Grey was born January 31st, 1872 in Zanesville, Ohio. So his birth name originated from newspaper descriptions of Queen Victoria's mourning clothes as Pearl Grey. He was the fourth of 5 children. He was born to an Alice Allie Joseph Zane. Her English Quaker immigrant ancestor, Robert Zane, came to the American colonies in 1673. And Alice's husband, Louis M. Grey, who was a dentist, his family changed his spelling of its last name to Grey after his birth. Later, Grey dropped Pearl and used Zane as his first name. So Zanesville was actually a city founded by his paternal grandfather, Benjamin Zane's brother-in-law, John McIntyre, who was the husband of Sarah Zane. He'd been given the land by Zane's maternal great-grandfather, Ebenezer Zane, an American Revolutionary War patriot. Zane had a brother, his name was Romer. They were both athletic, enthusiastic baseball players and fishermen. And from early on, he was intrigued by history. Soon he developed an interest in writing. Both Zane and his brother, Romer, were active athletic boys. They were enthusiastic baseball players and fishermen. He had that interest in history as well, as earlier mentioned. His knowledge of history informed his first 3 novels, which recounted the heroism of ancestors who fought in the American Revolutionary War. Grey, unfortunately, as a child, really engaged in a lot of violence, probably was most likely related to his father's beatings. His father was a pretty violent, sort of nasty guy, probably suffered from a lot of the same things that Zane did, whether there was bipolarism there or whatever the mental issues were. He really struggled, very antisocial. Thankfully, though, he was supported by a loving mother, and he found a substitute for his father. The man's name was Muddy Miser. He was an old man who approved of Grey's love of fishing and writing, and he also talked about the advantages of an unconventional life. Zane's father warned him to steer clear of miser, but as a boy, he spent much time during his 5 formative years in the company of the old man. Zane Grey was also an avid reader of adventure stories such as Robinson Crusoe and the Leatherstocking Tales. He also loved the dime novels featuring Buffalo Bill and Deadwood Dick. He also loved the illustrators, Howard Pyle and Frederick Remington, and how it just sort of everything corresponded and went together. He was particularly impressed with Our Western Border, which was a history of the Ohio frontier and likely inspired his earliest novels. Zane wrote his first story, Jim of the Cave, when he was 15, and his father tore it to shreds and beat him. His father wound up having financial setbacks in 1889 due to poor investments, and he wound up moving the family from Zanesville to Columbus, Ohio. Now, while his father struggled to reestablish his dental practice, Zane Grey made rural house calls and performed basic tooth extractions, which his father had taught him. Zane practiced until the state board intervened, and his brother then earned money by driving a delivery wagon. So they really had a lot of tough times early in his life, and he was, like in a lot of families at that time period, the sons, as you reached a certain age, you were expected to be a breadwinner and help out as well. Now, thankfully, one of the things he found a lot of joy in was playing summer baseball for the Columbus Capitals. Eventually, he was spotted by a baseball scout, and he received a bunch of offers from different colleges. Ultimately, he chose the University of Pennsylvania and did very, very well there, studying dentistry. And he was quite a good player. I believe he went on to play some minor league baseball, including Newark, the New Jersey Colts. His brother also played. I think Romer actually played one single major league game in 1903 for the Pittsburgh Pirates. After graduating from Penn University, he wound up establishing his practice dentistry in New York City under the name Dr. Zane Grey in 1896. It was a competitive area, but he wanted to be close to publishers, and he began to write whenever he was able to. He often went camping with his brother R.C. in Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania. He loved the Delaware River, and this was where he met 17-year-old Lena Roth, better known as Dolly. And she came from a family of physicians and was studying to be a school teacher. One of the things, unfortunately, that he struggled with his entire life is that he was a wanderer. And when I mean a wanderer, in love. He had a courtship with Dolly. They were married 5 years later in 1905, but he suffered bouts of depression, anger, mood swings, which was just one of those things he probably inherited that from his father, like we talked about earlier. He really was a lost soul in a lot of ways, and he was conscious of imminent death. He also had an issue with wandering with women, and this was something that Dolly was aware of. He said, "I love to be free. I cannot change my spots. The ordinary man is satisfied with a moderate income, a home, wife, children, and all that. But I am a million miles from being that kind of man, and no amount of trying will ever do any good. I shall never lose the spirit of my interest in women." And unfortunately, that was very, very true throughout his life. There was no doubt that he loved her very, very much, Dolly. But he also had many, many mistresses, and he spent a lot of time away from his family. Now, while Dolly managed Zane Grey's career and raised their 3 children, including a son named Romer Zane Grey, he spent the next 2 decades spent months away from his family. He fished, wrote, and spent time with his many mistresses. Now, Dolly apparently was aware of his behavior, and she viewed it more as his handicap than a choice, which, how you view that was how she did. but she managed his life. She managed his career. She was also like negotiated all his contracts, uh, and she was really good at editing. And because of that, his success happened really not only because of his extraordinary talent, but also because of her. Uh, they shared their income 50-50, and with her share, she covered all the family expenses. They say you can see their considerable correspondence shows the evidence of his lasting love for her, despite his infidelities and personal emotional turmoil. Now, in 1918, they moved from Pennsylvania to California to a town called Altadena, and that's where he built a home called the Zane Grey estate. Now, where Zane started to really fall in love with writing, like for novels, is he read Owen Wister's The Virginian, and that's where he decided he would write a novel. Now, his first novel was Betty Zane in 1903, which he really had a lot of trouble with the idea of writing. But the cool thing is, over time, with Dolly's help, he wound up starting to figure out the whole writing method and came up with his voice. She really was, in a lot of ways, not only that she loved him, but she was also a very steadying influence, as much as he continued to have his struggles with infidelity and his depression and all that kind of stuff. She really sort of grounded him in a lot of ways. From about 1925 on to his death in 1939, he started to travel further and further and further away from his family. He became really interested in exploring what he considered unspoiled lands, particularly the islands of the South Pacific, New Zealand, and Australia. He'd spent a lot of time in Arizona years previously and continuing on. He had like a cabin, and he just really was enamored with hunting, but more so fishing. And he actually wrote quite a bit for Outdoor Life. And one of the things that he really struggled with was the critics always sort of ripped him and his writing. They felt it was very stiff. It wasn't very realistic. It had a lot of moral inequities. And he really sort of got hit on for his novel The Vanishing American, which they sort of thought was patterned off of Jim Thorpe. It was about a Navajo hero that he sort of struggled to preserve the identity and culture against the corrupting influences of the white government and of missionaries. Well, this enraged religious groups. And he said, listen, I've studied the Navajo Indians for 12 years and I know their wrongs. He said the missionaries sent out there were almost to a person mean, vicious, weak, immoral, and useless men. Now, he had to make several changes to it to get it published, but he dealt with quite a lot of nastiness. He was involved with, he created a fishing club called the Porpoise Club that he founded with a friend, Robert H. Davis, to popularize the sport of hunting dolphins and porpoises, which was obviously not very popular either, especially in today's, would not be acceptable at all. But he was one of those people, sort of like Teddy Roosevelt, that they sort of went out. They were enamored with hunting and fishing and didn't always think about the consequences of their actions. Now, in 1939, October 23rd, Zane Grey died of heart failure. He was age 67 and was at his home. He is buried in the Lackawaxen and Union Cemetery. He was one of the first millionaire authors. They say he wrote over 9 million words, and his total book sales exceeded over 40 million. He really is an extraordinary guy. A lot of issues, obviously. his personal struggles. He was an intriguing guy, very talented, despite what critics say. Like I said before, my dad, one of his favorite authors was Zane Grey, and he lived quite an extraordinary life. Not necessarily probably what was best for him, but that was just sort of who he was, whatever his personal demons were. But so it is. They have the house there. There are several different museums around the country. I know there's one in Zanesville, Ohio. There's one, I think, in the Altadena, California. He really is. He's sometimes sort of forgotten, just because he was back in the early 1900s, early part of that century, and but considering how many of his books and short stories and novellas were made into movies and television series and episodes, he's a guy well worth remembering. And so wanted to tell his story today is another one of those sort of hometown heroes, interesting, intriguing individuals that is out there and wanted to talk about. And I want to say thanks once again to Colleen for her work. I do want to do something on. She sent me some pictures in that same envelope of a bridge there that I think was designed potentially by Roebling. So we'll go into that in another video. But once again, thank you, Colleen, and thank you to everybody for coming along. And we'll see you, as always, about town.